You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Andrew Salzberg, Head of Policy at Transit App. Andrew talks with us about Transit's Guide to Open Mobility as a Service and discusses how policy can create better travel experiences for everyone. Stay with us. The 2021 Revolution Transit and Community Development Virtual Conference is coming up October 19th to 21st. Registration is now open, and podcast listeners get a 10% discount. Use code TalkingHeadways21 when you register. Again, the code is TalkingHeadways and the number 21, no spaces. Use the code and join the conversation at Revolution coming up this October. Find out more at revolution.org/conference. That's revolution.org/conference. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting each month. And if you are a Patreon supporter, we just posted bonus materials with Laura Schul of Streetlight Data at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've started doing more bonus materials that enhance the initial episode, so check them out if you're a supporter. And if you're not a Patreon supporter and wish to join our merry band of transportation nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month and you'll get a handwritten note and some stickers. $10 a month and you'll get our bus-only scarf. Appreciate everyone that has supported and continues to support the show. And for a free trial of our 15-year-old Daily Cities newsletter, or for access to our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic Town Planning and Practice, go to theoverheadwire.com. Our newsletter is the oldest and the best in the business because we share information about what everyone else is doing. So check it out if you get a chance, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Well, Andrew Salzberg, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, welcome back to the podcast, I should say. A few changes since you last came into the studio for episode 197. Are you still in San Francisco or did you move elsewhere?
I am now in Montreal, Quebec.
How is Montreal?
It is nice.
I love Montreal.
Yeah. It's diagonally opposite the continent from San Francisco. So, I couldn't get much further away, right?
Is it diagonally mentally opposite as well? Is it a little bit different in that respect?
It's climate-wise, maybe more than politically or mentally. It's a lot colder here. We have a winter. I don't know if you're familiar with seasons in San Francisco, but we definitely have them up here.
What is that?
Yeah.
We've got permafall.
Yeah. Well, I miss that sometimes in January, but it's nice. I'm from here originally, so I grew up in Montreal. So I lived in the U.S. for 15 years, but now I'm back close to home.
Right. And I imagine life is a bit different now. What you been working on?
Yeah, a lot. Life is different. Most obviously, I am working with Transit, which I think is a lot of what we want to talk about today. Transit App to some people. And we've been working on a big report that just came out today, actually. We just finished the webinar that launched that report, which I think is what I'm excited about, that we've been working on for the last little while. And we can get in the weeds on that. But a big part of why I'm back in Montreal is that Transit, as well as being a great company, happens to be based in my hometown. So what more could you ask for?
That's awesome. Well, so for those that might not be familiar, what does Transit App do?
Yeah, Transit is the largest public transportation navigation app in North America. So basically, if you want to find anything from when your next bus is arriving to, step-by-step directions to take a trip to downtown on public transportation, that's our main use case. But over time, and increasingly, you can find everything from an Uber to a microtransit ride to a scooter, and you can both find and in many places unlock rides across those modes. So it's a trip planning app. It's a navigation app, but it doesn't have car directions. So it's everything other than your own car is what's in Transit. And that's a big difference from, Google or Apple Maps. And so we have a lot of dedicated users. There are millions of Transit users across North America who use it, to find their everyday journeys on everything that's not your own car.
When you talk to somebody who uses the Transit app, what is their kind of response? When you tell them that you work for Transit, what do they say? What is their feedback?
Yeah, we have a pretty passionate user base. I think one of the features you can use is that you can actually share your location with other people. So if you're riding a bus, and this happened in San Francisco when I lived there, actually, that the real-time notifications went down that was provided by the SFMTA. But Transit has sort of a crowdsourced version of that, where you can just volunteer to provide your GPS location when you're riding the bus, and that's used to provide other people who are waiting for the bus more accurate predictions. That's the kind of feature that people who use Transit volunteer to do, because the idea of sort of being part of a community of people who are using Transit, using public transportation generally, but also using the app, sort of bond together and actually, really enjoy. So I would say it's got a pretty passionate user base, fan base. And if you talk to someone who's a Transit user, they tend to be pretty enthusiastic about it.
I guess that's better to share your location yourself rather than having. I had a situation where Google Maps asked me how my ride was on the bus after I got off, and I didn't tell it that I was there.
Yes,
it as an intelligent being of some sort, I guess. But
yeah, right.
So,
no, Transit's pretty careful as a company about asking people when they're engaging and using their information like that. But it's amazing how many people are willing to sort of volunteer that information in the context of helping other public transport riders.
Right, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Well, so you did come on to talk about this recent document, the Guide to Open Mobility as a Service. You all discussed creating open mobility standards and the like. What does that mean specifically? What does an open mobility standard mean to you?
Excellent question, Jeff. I think I like to talk about it by using an analogy. So the one that's most obvious to me, we have lots of digital systems where data standards are already a thing. And so my favorite example is in communications. So if you think about email, which, it's not a very exciting topic, but if I send you an email and you use Yahoo and I use Gmail and we include someone else who uses Hotmail, like our messages get to each other and we don't really have to think about it. The fact that I'm even saying it probably strikes people as kind of odd. It's so boring and mundane, it happens in the background. But the only reason that's the case is because, literally 50 years ago in the 1970s, people got together and set up the data standard for how email actually works. And it's been working on that standard ever since, which means that, no one company controls the interface. No one company can dominate it. And it doesn't matter what client you use or what software you use to send email, we can all exchange with each other. So that's a way in which that system was built on an open data standard. And if you contrast that with other ways to message someone, if I want to message my cousin who uses Facebook Messenger, I have to download Facebook Messenger to send her a message. And that means that even if I don't like Facebook for whatever reason, I don't love the company or the interface is clunky or I just have enough messaging apps, I still have to download that app. And that's because there's no open standard for sending someone a Facebook Messenger message, right? You have to be in that little ecosystem to be able to use it. And so broadly speaking, the purpose of our guide that we put out around open mobility as a service is to try and provide a pathway for mobility as it goes increasingly digital to work more like email and less like Facebook Messenger. And we can get into the specifics, but I think at a high level, if that happens, we have a theory, and I personally have a real strong belief that system is going to be more transparent, more accountable, ultimately also more equitable for riders and more sustainable if we can do it that way. So that's kind of the big picture theme.
Yeah, we hear a lot about this idea of the quote unquote walled garden.
Yeah.
The idea that, they want to keep whoever they is, they want to keep, users inside of their local ecosystem instead of allowing them to break out and to be different. So what gives you kind of heart that actually would happen with an open data system that is more akin to email than, say, Facebook Messenger?
Yeah. Well, I think it's, I don't want to sound like it's going to be easy, right? I don't think there's any guarantee that it will happen. I think a lot of
You mean it's not happening tomorrow?
Yeah, well, there are pieces of it we could talk about that are happening already. There's some really good stuff that's actually happening. So I don't want to be overly negative, but I also don't want to pretend like this stuff's just going to happen on its own and the system will magically work. I think there's a lot of investment money and businesses that really want to have as much control over mobility systems and frankly other areas of business too, so that they can funnel their users to the place that makes the most sense for them. Like, I came on the show last time and I worked at Uber, and at the time or around then, I think Uber was sort of using a tagline of being the Amazon of transportation. And if you think about that now, a few years later, there's a lot of worry, I think, about what the power of Amazon is and how does it work to show you one seller or another, and why do they do that, and how much power does that give them over suppliers, and whose interests are they working in. And I think, generally speaking, probably Amazon might not be the model we would love to choose for how our mobility system would work. So I think that we want to try and outline a different way to do things, but I don't want to pretend like it's the easy way. In some ways, I think it's more challenging, which is why it takes a concerted group of people to actually make it happen. And that's, one of the things in the guide is that it's really, Transit wrote the guide, obviously, but it's not about transit. Inside there are at least a dozen or more companies that we highlight who are doing things differently, and either they're providing open APIs as a microtransit provider in the case of Spare, or they have an API for a mobile ticketing platform like Masabi in Ohio does, so multiple people can actually buy transit tickets really easily. So there's lots and lots of examples of individual companies or organizations that are laying the groundwork for a more email-like vision of the future of mobility. But I think it's going to take a lot of energy and dedication to actually make that the way things go.
Are there bigger examples that you might pull from as well? I mean, The first thing that popped in my head was Verkehrsverbund, which we've had folks on the podcast talking about, Ralph Bueller at Virginia Tech. Are there other examples around the world that we can kind of take from to think about this in a larger context than maybe just a region like Verkehrsverbund is?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think the most basic example that I like is one that, again, is almost so obvious that we don't think about it. But, GTFS, so for those who don't know, that's the General Transit Feed Specification. That's the way that basically every transit agency in North America of any size publishes their schedule information, in most cases also real-time information, to the world, to the public, for free, in a pretty permissive license, which is how when you open Google Maps or you open Transit or you open Apple Maps and you get transit information, that's where that comes from. But that only happened because 15 years ago, TriMet in Portland worked with Google to find and create a standard for sharing public transit information. So when I tell the story of how we want to build this big vision of open mobility as a service, the nice thing is, while it's sort of daunting to do that, it's not like we haven't done pieces of it already. So I think GTFS is a really good example of transit agencies, work to create a data standard and now publish it almost ubiquitously, so much so that we kind of forget that it's important and happening. And if you dial back 10 years ago, we have a quote link in the guide to a New York Times article about the MTA suing app developers who had managed to get a hold of their schedule information and build apps for people to find when their bus was going to arrive, which sounds funny now, 12 years later. But that was kind of a lot of the thinking for transit agencies and others, that you want to keep all these things under lock and key and build your own interface, et cetera. And we broke out of that almost universally. And people now assume that having that information out to wherever people want to access it is the way to do it. So for me, a really strong example that's a really positive one, not just in mobility, but I think in data standards generally, is that GTFS has been remarkably successful and very well adopted. And frankly, I work at Transit. The company wouldn't exist if it wasn't for that innovation. It only started in 2011, in the wake of GTFS kind of being more and more widespread. So I think we don't have to look outside of mobility, honestly, to find super good open data standard examples that have powered, business models and new companies.
And I guess we're stuck with the acronyms now, right? Like the GTFS, GOFS, GBFS, MDS, MOS, more generally. Are we going to ever get out of that, or are we stuck?
Well, I think it's, we can blame the bike share crowd, because I think once it became, GTFS was one thing, and you might think it's not the most, doesn't really roll off the tongue as an acronym. But once the bike share group got GBFS in there, it was sort of like, well, everything else has to be, GXFS. Like, we could talk about GOFS to get into the weeds, but the nice thing there is that some people have started calling it GoFS, which is a little catchier maybe than saying GTFS.
I do like that better. GoFS.
Yeah.
So the document kind of reviews a lot of the positive actions of many companies that are going open and doing open standards. But is there anything that's new in the document that has come out that's kind of, not revolutionary, but just something that's being introduced?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things we could talk about. One thing that's pretty new is what we were just talking about with GoFS. So, we talked about GTFS being the transit feed specification. And then, 10 years later, bike share came up with the GBFS for bike share. And now that's being used for scooter and dockless bike share and even car share. But, one of the weird things that I've known from my life when I worked at Uber and beyond is that there is no equivalent data standard to those two for taxi and ride hail, and also some of the on-demand transit services, which I always kind of struck me as pretty odd that we haven't tried to come up with a basic way to show that information, even though lots of integrations have happened for taxi and ride hail in whether it's Google or Transit or elsewhere. So one of the things that's pretty new and frankly is still a work in progress is this idea of GTFS for taxi ride hail. And that's what we're calling the General On-Demand Feed Specification, the GOFS. And Mobility Data, who's mentioned several times in the handbook, it's a nonprofit actually based in Montreal. They're the ones who manage a lot of these data standards, and they're the ones who are running a working group to see if they can actually create that data standard. So that's new enough in the sense that we have a name for it, but it doesn't actually exist in the world, and there's a working group coming up with it. So we reference it in the guide as a model for the very near future where people can ask taxi, ride hail, on-demand transit providers to give them information in a standardized way, but it doesn't actually exist. So that's one really concrete thing that is new in the book. But I would say the other thing that's new in the book for me is thinking about all this stuff as kind of a unified idea, right? The idea that there's been something called mobility as a service, which I'm sure you've talked about on the show. And we can talk about all the hope, maybe hype around it, and maybe some of the disappointment. And I think we're talking about how do we do that in a way that is open, and how are data standards part of that. So to me, one of the big new things is telling the story of linking the progress in GTFS, the creation of some of these data standards, the work that's happening in mobile payment, not as individual isolated things, but as part of a big movement to actually see if we can build a digital future for mobility that is more open and interoperable.
How would all of these things kind of come together? I mean, they're all separate in their own way. I mean, you have payment systems, you have the different transportation modes. How would they come together as well? I mean, obviously this hasn't completely been answered yet, because otherwise if we had the answers, we'd be winning. But but we don't. But how do these all come together as one, like a Voltron, as it were?
Well, yeah, I can tell you, there's a good example right here in Montreal where I am, where you can actually buy a ticket on the bus system using mobile ticketing in Transit app. And you can also unlock a bike share on the bike share system here, that's Bixi. So you're right. Those are all different systems, right? The idea that the person who operates Bixi, or the company that operates the bike share system here, and the person who runs mobile ticketing for the transit system are very different systems, but they are now coming together in Transit app to allow you to both buy a bus ticket and unlock a bike. So there are specific places these are coming together. I'm highlighting examples from Transit, but there are other examples too. We're working in Denver with RTD there, and they're the mobile ticketing provider. Uber was one of the early people to consume the API, and you can actually buy a transit ticket in the Uber app. You can also buy that ticket in the Transit app. And increasingly, you can unlock a bike in some of the same places. So there are individual places where these things are starting to come together, where different operators are making it possible to both find, discover, and pay for your ride. So you're right, it's far from universal, but the nice thing is that if you think about a handful of markets, Las Vegas is another one where the transit operator is working with the bike share operator. That's B-Cycle and RTC there in Las Vegas, who make it possible to do a combined transit ticketing and bike share purchasing. So, I think we could all be a little bit disappointed that the magical MOS future is not here, but it's not that there's zero examples where the full level of integration from payment and unlocking through discovery, et cetera, is happening. So it's exciting to find some nuggets of positive breakthroughs on this that are indeed happening.
How hard is it for writers to figure out there are apps out there to get on board? I mean, for me personally, I still haven't transferred my Clipper card to my Apple Pay because I'm like, well, I'm going to lose my Clipper card. I mean, I won't lose it, the fare media itself, but once you transfer it out, the card's dead basically. And then also, I know this is going to be blasphemy to Steven. I think I told him before, but and I use Rootsie as my app, and I've used it forever. Yeah, I know, exactly. By the way, Stephen Miller is staring at us through Zoom. I should let folks know who are listening to the podcast just because I'm referencing his name. But that's because I'm just a creature of habit. I've done it forever since it came out. And, I don't, at the moment anyways, I don't see any reason why I would change away from that. It's my home system. I know where I'm going most of the time. I just, refill my Clipper card at the BART station. So like, how hard is it to get people to adopt these newer kind of technologies that would lead to a better world for everybody, a more coordinated world, as it were?
Yeah. Well, first I would say, I don't think the fact that you use that set of systems is bad and someone should try and change it, right? I think one of the things we want to talk about in the book is kind of complicate the idea, or the guide, sorry, and complicate the idea that there's going to be one point of access to the whole system, and you, Jeff, need to go to, MOS Incorporated to buy all your tickets, or else the system is a failure. I think one of the things we want to highlight and we really try and hit on is that the hope is not that there's one magical app that rules them all. It's short for MOS app, right?
Yeah.
The idea, I think the whole point of having these standards is to say, well, people can find and unlock and pay for and discover these trips in whatever system makes the most sense for them. And you're right. There's a lot of people who use the same system every day, and maybe they like paying cash, or they have their Clipper card and they're comfortable with it. That's great. Those people are probably regular transit users, and I think that's not really a problem. I think in general, to me, the kind of high level hope for this whole business of why do we care about making bikes and transit and car share more easy to find, more easy to pay for, more interoperable, is in general that all of that increases the attractiveness of the system, and then more people use it, right? I think most of the benefits you can ascribe to any future mobility as a service system is that more people use the alternatives to the car, right? I mean, that's what transit is. It's literally every mode besides your own car. And the hope is, how do we make those things more attractive? So the fact that you are happy with the set of apps and services you use, I think that's fine. I think there's no reason that we necessarily have to change that. And I think in the future world we're imagining, there's probably a plethora of different ways to access your service. But the point is that increasingly we want to make sure that transit is competitive at the center of that, and that it's easy to find and purchase tickets. It's easy to combine that with other modes. That to me is the main story. There's not going to be, San Francisco MassApp.com, where everybody has to go and unlock their services. There's just fundamentally that the operations of all those different systems work better together, so that anybody can find what they need wherever they're used to using it. And the nice thing is there, ideally Transit app, my company, can compete for you and find value for you in how they build it. But if they don't, that's okay too, right? I think we want to make sure we're building for users and adding value to them and not forcing anybody to use something they don't want to use.
Yeah, and I don't think I'm a regular type of, I'm not a traditional like regular user, but I'm also thinking about, the folks that they go to a city and they want to use the transit system there. And then, because it's so difficult to figure out what the fare is, or it's so difficult to figure out how to get on the bus or where to go, or, I think early adoption. I think right now we're seeing, a lot of folks rethinking the way that they move around because of this traumatic experience that we've all gone through in the last year. And I think it's been shown through research that when somebody moves to a new place, they're more open to a new system or a new way of getting around. And then once they get the routine in place, then they're set. So, these changes, there's a way to get new people on board that might not have got on board before and get them out of their car. And for many people, because the Lyft and Uber apps are so easy to open and they probably used them before, that's the go-to, right? That's the first thing that people do. So, how do we get people to kind of, in my opinion, get away from just going into the ride-hail app and getting all of these other plethora of opportunities that might be available to them?
Absolutely. When I worked at Uber, I was in a lot of events with transit agencies, and people were complaining that, look, it's just so much easier to open Uber in a new city and pay for a ride without thinking about it than it is to do the same on a transit agency. And I experienced that too. When I go to a new city for a conference, when I used to travel, 18 months ago, finding a way to pay for services sometimes is so painful that, you give up trying to do it. And so how do we fix that? And I think there is some hope now that apps like ours and others are making it that you don't have to think about downloading an individual app for ticketing in each agency you travel to. There are many companies that are in the mobile ticketing space who are making those kinds of integrations into services like ours easier. We talk about people like Token Transit or Masabi or Bytemark, who are some of the vendors in the space who are making some of those things simpler so that, we can compete. That goes back to our fundamental point, right? If we're making transit or even alternatives like bike share and everything else harder to access, clearly we're limiting the use of those systems, particularly for people who are traveling. And I think your point about COVID being a real moment of, we don't know what the future of commuting looks like. I think a lot of people really genuinely don't know. Even if you're able to go back to the office right now, are we doing that 5 days a week or 3 days a week or 2 days a week? Some people have changed their location preferences. Some of them are moving to lower density areas. It's really far from clear what the future of transportation looks like. So I think that's another reason we wanted to try and get this guide out now, because, a lot of transit agencies, and we've seen this in our data, have obviously been down 80, 90% at the depths of the pandemic, coming back up now. So that's very scary. But as people start to come back, I think people are thinking creatively about what the future looks like. And we've seen during COVID a lot more activity on things like mobile payment or on-demand transit pilots, people trying to experiment with new ways to attract users. And the more that we can stitch those things together and make them seamless to the rider, I think the more hope they have for success. I think it's an important moment for that as well.
I'm curious what you think the future looks like. On the show, we've tried to avoid predictions of the future because we have no idea what's going to happen, honestly. We give people an idea of what other people are saying. And I know that, for example, Emily Badger had a really great New York Times article last week about flattening the rush hour. But I'm curious what your kind of general thoughts are. I'm not asking you to predict, but I'm curious what your general thoughts are about the future of rush hour, of transit, of commuting, those types of things, given the guidebook.
Yeah, I think I like your idea of not making predictions. It always saves you the embarrassment of having to look back at them later.
Or it could be fun. Yona Freemark and I do that every year, and it's a way to give each other a hard time about bad predictions the year before. But go on.
Right. Oh yeah. Well, reading someone else's predictions is great. So I'd love to read yours, Jeff, but I'll keep my notes up. But yeah, I think the rush hour piece in the New York Times article you mentioned was great, because it does seem like that's where, if people are able, even if you have to go back to the office sometimes, whether it's within a day or over the course of the week, you have more flexibility, you're probably not going to choose to sit in your car an extra hour at 8 a.m. And you might be leading off peak hour commutes, or maybe you don't like a crowded subway and you want to go in at 10 a.m. instead of 8 a.m. or whatever your previous pattern was. So it seems like some percentage of employers are going to give some portion of their employees more flexibility to be in an office less often. That seems like what we're looking at. Some percentage is a pretty vague term. But what do people do with more flexibility? And I think it's interesting to see that, remote work, which, I spend a lot of time thinking about climate change as well. And people often hold that up as a potential benefit for people traveling less. But actually, anecdotally, we're seeing people who do remote work can actually end up traveling more because they, stay in a suburban area and go out for lunch with a buddy of theirs. So, I think for us in the context of the guide that we put out, which is designed to help public agencies, really take the reins of the system and keep the public interest at the heart of it, we want to make sure that all the modes that are alternatives to driving are really as competitive as possible in the time that I think, I'm a little nervous about what the future looks like. I don't think the trends in COVID have been on balance positive. I think we're probably seeing a mix, but I have a lot of things to be worried about in terms of how we think about transportation. So to me, this guide is a chance to equip public agencies with the best tools they can to try and, keep transit at the center of the mobility system and, try and keep sustainable choices kind of competitive with other options.
What are you worried about? What's the fear coming around the bend?
I mean, to me, I think that some of the, remote work preferences and some of the, changes in commuting patterns may be difficult for transit to compete with, right? If we're talking about more suburban trips, more remote work, people changing locations and moving further out, moving up to Napa Valley and only having to commute to San Francisco once a week or once a month, I think that might start to impact transit systems, but also I think it might start to boost the overall amount of travel mileage people are doing, which I think has consequences elsewhere as well. So, there's a lot of good stories about shared streets and bikes and embracing that technology, which are genuinely positive. There's also some things to be worried about, I think, in terms of some of the remote work location changes and what that says for cities and density and transit.
It's interesting. I find that a lot of folks are worried about the 3-day work week changing people's commute patterns. People thinking that they can drive to work on that 1 or 2 days instead of taking transit to work. I actually might be thinking that it's actually going to make transit more viable because everybody thinking that they can drive to work 1 or 2 days a week might, turn out to be a mess. And if you look at the Bay Bridge, I mean, getting over that one, bottleneck every day is a monster. So
totally,
even if people are going to work, maybe 3 days a week or maybe on Mondays and Fridays or whatever, their preferences are, I feel like it's going to get real weird for people who think that they can drive from Napa 1 day a week or twice a week, because everybody's going to think that they can drive from Napa 1 day a week or twice a week. And then we get back into the same problem we had where everybody was thinking they can drive to work every 5 days a week. So, like I said, I don't like to make the predictions and I'm not making a prediction, but I think it might get weird in that way somehow.
Right. And I think in the long run, we always think about peak hour trips being when transit does its best work. And there's some truth to that. But it's also true that serving that brief peak is what all the infrastructure is built for. And actually, it's kind of costly to have all your rides kind of concentrate in this very short period. So I think if people are spreading out their commutes a little bit, and if transit agencies and public agencies in general can find sustainable ways to serve that demand, it could be good. And I think part of this guide is that it's, that means that if people are commuting differently and making those decisions on the fly, it's maybe less predictable and less 9 to 5. So that probably argues that transit agencies and others have to be a little more nimble and kind of ready to adapt to how people want to get around. So it's a moment of potential change. And I think we need everything we can to be on the side of, smart decision making in transportation.
Y'all recently brought in LA Metro, which seems like a pretty big deal. Before, there were lots of agencies operating their own apps, but recently, it seemed that they finally figured out it was a waste of their time. How are all these kind of wins shifting from transit agencies wanting to have their own app to actually coming in and asking folks like transit to do more?
Yeah, well, we're very excited about the partnership with LA Metro. It's one of 75 agencies across North America who's a partner of transit, where people have asked, like you just said, they've endorsed transit as kind of their chosen place for their riders to get real-time information. MBTA in Boston is another example of the kind of work we're doing at LA Metro. So I think we're seeing more of a movement in that direction. And in some ways, it mimics what we saw with GTFS. We talked about at the very beginning of the show, where, when I go back in my head to 2009, 2010, a lot of people were commissioning pretty expensive and involved kind of web trip planners for each individual agency to sort of go and plan your journey, that were custom built and tended to be not the most compelling user interfaces. And transit agencies kind of shifted from that to say, well, we're going to provide the underlying data and we're going to run really good service, but we don't necessarily actually have to build the software that gets you access to that. So I think part of what we're seeing with people endorsing transit app as an LA Metro, works in the same trend, I think, of transit agencies obviously being the only agency equipped to run service and do amazing things that they do, but maybe not always being most able to kind of keep an app up to date and make it as compelling as possible for users. And to your point, make it so that I can open the same app in multiple cities and get the same experience. So yeah, we're seeing more choices of agencies moving to be partners of ours across the country.
Now, I'm still trying to understand MDS and everything that goes along with the infighting about it,
yes,
the pushback on it, the adoption of it, et cetera. Can you kind of clear that up for me, what MDS is for, maybe what it's not for, how it relates to GTFS and all the other standards that like the alphabet soup kind of gets a little bit thick?
Yes. Well, great question, Jeff. And you'll be happy to know that MDS is a very different problem and solution set than what we're talking about with this Open Mobility as a Service guide.
Right.
So really the most basic way to think about it, I think that on one side, if you think about the mobility operators kind of sitting in the middle, in one direction, they're facing their regulators and they have a stream of information they're required to give to the regulators. And on the other side, they're facing consumers, people like you and me who actually use the services. And the kind of data standards we're talking about usually fall into one or the other of those buckets. So when you think about GTFS, that's a data standard for a transit agency to communicate with the public. It's not something that's going between, a mobility operator and a regulator. But MDS, in the other example, MDS is really about, if you're a bike share operator in Los Angeles, you are providing an MDS feed to LADOT as part of their oversight of your operations. But you and me as regular people who take bike share never see the MDS data feed, and it's not part of our day-to-day reality. So bike share has something called the GBFS feed, right? That's the consumer-facing piece. So all of these G-blank-FS are really consumer-facing data standards. In the book, we call those MOS data standards to kind of give them a family, because they're really about enabling this mobility as a service vision, whereas MDS is much more of a regulatory tool designed to make it easy to give a lot of information from operators to public agencies and regulators that oversee that.
Is MOS the right way to explain the system overall? I've seen, negative reactions. I have commenters for the podcast that say, "Why are you using that term? I don't like it."
Yeah, yeah. I know. We I think there's a lot of reason to have mixed feelings about it. The presentation that we give about MOS, I think we highlight some of the disappointment around the term, right, and how much it's been a hype term. We actually, if you Google MOS and look up images, you can actually find like stock images of mobility as a service with like a guy and his finger and, magical glowing technology floating, right? It's like the most sort of stock, cheesy, overhyped technology thing. So there's a lot of that feeling around MOS. But in practice, I think if you think about what the actual vision described was, which is that, increasingly we have more digital technology in how we get around. There are new modes of on-demand transport. And if we get them to work together, they can be more compelling than driving your car. I think that idea, which we haven't really seen in practice, but the name for that and the reality of what that could be, I think is real. So we decided to embrace the MOS term, which I agree is, not without controversy, and then say we're building an open version of it. And I don't think there's really another term that encompasses the whole suite of things we're talking about, from finding, planning, paying for your ride, and doing that as a cooperative endeavor across a bunch of companies, all in service of outcompeting the car. So, I agree. There's plenty of reasons to be disappointed and maybe jaded about the term MOS, but I think the hope is still there. And we're excited about, we talked about some of the examples are real. I really can right now in Montreal, without creating a new account, buy a bus ticket, unlock a bike. So it is happening. And when it does happen, you're kind of like, oh my God, I can't believe this actually works. So we're optimistic about building more of those experiences and kind of taking that term, making it open and, putting a movement behind it.
Which section of the document were you most excited to read?
To read. Well, what about writing it, Jeff? We have to put it all together.
Well, I understand. I understand
part.
that, but this is my question. When you're thinking about putting this together, what was your most exciting part of it to write and then read?
I think to me, one of the things we do at the very end of the document is talk about how these pretty abstract things, you mentioned the alphabet soup, actually relate to the core things we care about in transportation, right? What I care about is sustainable mobility and how we actually enable the kinds of travel patterns we think are going to help us do things like fight climate change. And so how is it that having a system that's more open and based on open data standards can actually build a better mobility system? Not just, a better MOS vision, but actually how does that relate to the things that you find in every transport plan across the country and every strategic plan you see? So whether that's sustainability, or I think interestingly, how do you think about it from an equity perspective? Or how do you think about it enabling better public procurement? I mean, those are the things that I think we haven't really talked about, mostly because we've been fighting battles about the basic nuts and bolts of how do you pay for a ticket in someone else's app. But if we can get over that, then what are the benefits?
Along the same vein, I mean, how can these be integrated into long-range plans, into, city transportation plans? Even yesterday, Charlotte passed their 2040 comprehensive plan with new zoning standards. Is that something that you can build this into somehow where you're connecting the dots on transportation and land use?
Yeah, I think land use might be a little far outside, although I think I think in the long
Everything's
run,
connected.
everything's connected. I think land use is ultimately important for enabling transport outcomes. To me, this document, we're clear inside in this report that smart digital, technology strategies around mobility are not a replacement for real strong infrastructure, right? You can't make an app that makes up for the fact that you don't have any bike lanes in your city, or that transit only runs every 2 hours. I think they're complementary efforts. So to me, what I would like to see is, yes, in long-term, long-range plans, when people talk about investments in concrete and rail lines, also thinking carefully about how do we also enable technology that actually complements the work we're doing on the ground. They're not one or the other, but I think in practice we think about them as very different things typically, right? There are public transport infrastructure investment plans, and then maybe as an afterthought, if we're lucky, there's a little bit about technology kind of in there and consumer facing stuff. So I would love to see them thought of more explicitly together, because in practice, I think you might get pretty good value for money out of some of the digital technology if done right, especially in the way we're talking about in the guide, which is really about opening things up for multiple parties to be able to find and book a transit ticket, for instance. That can only help in a strategy where you're putting serious money into the ground to kind of change behavior, change land use, increase bus frequencies. All those things are really critical. And we go to pains to say in the book, digital technology is not a replacement for them, but it is definitely complementary. And I think it'd be nice to see them thought about a little more explicitly together.
You mentioned climate change as well. And you also recently chatted with Dan Sperling of UC Davis. And we had him on when he finished his book, the Three Revolutions book. I'm wondering what you learned from that conversation and if it was kind of eye-opening to a certain extent.
I mean, the reason it's fun to talk to Dan is that, I don't know, there's nobody else that I can think of who's not only been working on climate change, but working on transport and climate change literally for at least 35 years, maybe longer. And we could embarrass Dan by saying how long he's been doing it, but certainly since the 80s, so you can find references. So I think just getting someone who's been through the cycle of, hype about XYZ technology or XYZ strategy and been around long enough to sort of see those things come up and fade and have some perspective on what's happening in that movement is kind of amazing. So I think it's hard to resist having a chat. Dan, and how many transport climate change experts have been on the Daily Show, which I know is becoming a dated reference, but it's pretty good to break through with pretty wonky text to get to that level. So yeah, there's always something to learn from Dan.
I watch a lot of Daily Show too, and I think they often have a recurring cast of characters too, so it's hard to break through in that way. So it's that makes it even more impressive. Was there anything that he said that really interested you or really kind of made you think about things a little bit differently?
Yeah, I think he had a funny point. We were talking about autonomous vehicles, and I worked in Silicon Valley world in 2016, 17 when there was a lot of hype around autonomous vehicles, and then I think a lot of disappointment, and maybe now a little bit of recovery. And he wasn't quite as cynical about hype as you might have expected. And he was telling a story about Mary Nichols sort of actually being somewhat of a proponent of hype, as sort of you need a little bit of fairy dust to get people excited about things, even if it doesn't always work out. It's kind of an important motivational tool, and I think he's, as you mentioned in his book, a bit of a believer that autonomous vehicles can do good work. And he kind of feels like hype is just part of the process of getting investment and activity. So it's kind of funny to hear, a relatively staid academic being not totally opposed to, tech company hype, which I feel like oftentimes are opposed in opposition to each other.
Yeah. And I also, I think one of the things that was interesting to me in talking with him, but also reading your interview with him was, kind of the messaging about it all. And that relates to the hype to a certain extent. And, VMT as a, phrase, as a structure for reducing greenhouse gas emissions is generally seen as good. That's what we've, kind of organized things in California around reducing VMT, reducing emissions, but it's not going to get anybody excited.
No. Yeah, exactly. I think his point about what we're trying to do, at least the way you want to talk about it, even if mathematically you could measure this as a VMT reduction, describing it as VMT reduction appeals to almost nobody outside of maybe you and I and a handful of listeners to your podcast, maybe, but not a huge constituency. And so I think he was talking about, we should be framing it around alternatives to the car, which is sort of obvious, but I think important. And it goes back to what we're talking about, in the guide and the work that I'm doing at Transit is, how do we make everything that is not the car as compelling and easy to use as the car? And that, that's what Transit's mission is, and that's what we're doing, and that's what this guide is about, trying to unlock all the pieces of the mobility ecosystem so that we can bring them all together and try and make alternatives to driving your car be more compelling. And that's part of, good transport policy at the city level for a whole bunch of reasons. But one of the ones I talked about with Dan was climate, and how wholly banking all of your hopes on electrifying vehicles and not even touching the fact that maybe we should travel a little less or a little differently, I think is a mistake. And so that's a big part of what I think this report is about too, is, everybody's talking about mode shift. Everything increasingly is digital. How do we make sure that we're building those digital systems in a way that makes the mode shift work a little simpler? And one more thing on that too, there's a lot of money going into electric vehicle subsidies, obviously. And there's also some work to think about, well, how do we incentivize potentially mode shift behavior? And so one of the things we also touch on briefly in the guide is, well, how does an open and interoperable system let you be more intelligent about subsidizing individual trips or subsidizing, trip making behavior where you're dropping off a bike at a train station, or you're doing more targeted investment and subsidy in low income passes for different modes of transportation, making those easier to access. So I think the conversation around subsidies and incentive and building open MaaS in a way that's actually usable and interoperable do go together as well. So there's lots of ways where I think this kind of pure tech conversation touches back on some of the core policy things we're working on in transportation.
Who's the guide for specifically? Is it for agencies? Is it for the general population, transit riders? Who should read it?
I think the primary audience is probably public agencies, both not just transit agencies, but across transport regulators and public agencies. And we really specifically in the different sections, we go through and highlight guides for public agencies. If you're thinking about your car share system in the context of a broader open mobility as a service system, how should you think about it? Or if you're thinking about mobile ticketing in that context, or ride hail and taxi or microtransit. So there's very specific kind of guidance for public agencies. So that's the main audience, I would say, the number one. But the other thing we really do in there is we have lots of highlight boxes about other private companies that are building in an open, interoperable way. And so we're shouting them out there because I think we sort of recognize there's a kind of alliance of people who are doing this together, but maybe don't always think of themselves as working on the same problem in the same way. So part of the goal of the guide, I think, is to make other people aware of what's happening. If you're building a company from the ground up and you're a startup in the mobility world, this could be a guide to say that there's not one way to do things, and there are other companies in your world who are building in a way that are actually open and interoperable and work with the kind of vision of MaaS. So yeah, I would say public agencies, private companies, and increasingly there's more and more nonprofits. So the ones, whether it's the Shared Use Mobility Center or Mobility Data or a wide array of organizations that are thinking about these topics, or APTA trade associations, right? There's a huge world of transportation organizations that are also thinking about this heavily. And last but not least, if you're someone who listens to this podcast, I think you would get a kick out of it. I think Transit is a company that writes things in a way that's a little snappier than the average publication. So don't think boring PDF, think snappy, exciting guide to open mobility as a service.
That's still a PDF.
It's still a PDF. Should I say where you can get it? You're going to put it in the show notes, right?
Yeah, so put it in the show notes. Yeah, where can folks find it?
They can find it at transit.app/MAAS. So MaaS, transit.app/MaaS.
What's next? It's out today. Obviously, people can get, this is going to be 2 weeks in the future, but it's out today.
Yeah.
What's next? What are you going to do with the guide now that it's out and in the world?
Yeah. So I think we're doing a lot, and we're seeing a lot of, like I mentioned, throughout the COVID pandemic, there were lots of people, public agencies, who were procuring things like mobile ticketing or on-demand transit. And we're seeing a growth of public agencies getting involved in various forms of new mobility technology. And so one of the things we're seeing as a useful next step for the guide is, how can we make public procurement in a way that responds to the need to have these systems actually work together? And so we're talking to lots of public agencies, lots of technology vendors, to see if we can agree on how we actually make these things work together. So that's one broad angle, is just sort of taking this guide out to people who are wrestling with these problems right now. But the other one that we talk about in the book is that this is not a finished process, right? We talked at the very beginning of this interview about taxi and ride hail and on-demand transit not having a data standard. So that is a work in progress. And very soon, the first version of that data standard is going to be published. And we would love people who are in the space, either as operators or consumers of that data or public agencies, to get involved and make sure that becomes a living, breathing thing. And even further down the road, I mentioned that mobile payment for transit is really kind of nowhere near having a data standard. We're starting to get different APIs working together, but no one's come up with a way that these things could be standardized. So I think, the report talks about some of the stuff that's already done and that can be adopted, but a lot of this is work that still has to be done. And so it's kind of a call to action to get involved in some of these projects that people can find in the guidebook.
Well, I definitely recommend people go and get it. It's a pretty quick and easy read. I got my copy yesterday and went through it pretty quickly, so it's pretty easy. It's not a 200-page, 300-page book. It's actually pretty snappy and good, and I appreciate that a lot as a reader.
Yes.
Andrew, where can folks find you? Where can folks find you online?
Online, well, I would say I spend too much time on Twitter, so that's always a good place. So if you go to...
Don't we all?
Yeah, well, not all of us, but yeah, some of us. Yeah. If you find me on Twitter at Andrew Salzberg, that's a good place to look me up.
Awesome. And you have your newsletter, right?
I have a newsletter too, yes. Thank you for making sure I plug that. If you go to Decarbonizing Transportation, it's a very creatively named newsletter about decarbonizing transportation. So check that one out as well.
And if you're interested, make sure to download the Transit app to use it to go wherever your heart leads you. 300
cities around the world.
That's awesome. Well, Andrew Salzberg, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at TheOverheadWire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Kidways.